Good evening, everyone, and welcome. See some friends in the audience. My name's Randy Bluffstone. I'm the professor of economics here at Portland State and also director of the Institute for Economics and the Environment. And it's my pleasure tonight to introduce Dr. James Boyd to you. Before I do that, I'd like to just thank some folks and welcome you to the lecture today, and also to all the people who are streaming and will be viewing the archived lecture on the IE website. I'd also like to thank the Institute for Sustainable Solutions here at Portland State University, who are co-funding with the Department of Economics this Institute for Economics and Environment series, Environment, Economics, and You. And so thanks very much to the folks that are making this possible. I'd like to mention also that next Friday, a week from tomorrow, Dr. Charles Kolstad will be here, and he'll be, it's not in this room, it's in another room in this building. He's going to be talking about, let's see, the title is Obama, Climate Change, and the 2015 Paris Climate Negotiations. So Charlie was a member of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Working Group 3. He was a lead convening author. So there's very few people who are better placed to kind of give us the prognosis of what we might hear from Paris. As you all know, the big negotiations will be occurring in December in Paris. So if you can turn out or have a look at the IE website because it'll be streamed and archived there as well. You know, in preparing kind of some just brief introductory remarks, I was kind of musing on the topic of may you live in interesting times, and I was thinking that this applied to the climate change. That we have a good challenge, good work to do, and so I dug into this a little bit, and it turns out that this is an apocryphal saying that's actually from Chinese, and it's maybe even more applicable because what it means, to paraphrase, is better to live in calm rather than turbulent, meaning warring in those days, warring times. And so this second term really, as I was thinking about it, seems much more applicable to the climate change problem. What's so great about having to step up to such a challenge as dealing with climate change? It's sort of like, if you have 220 current, grab both of the wires and see, just to see what happens. That's not kind of what we would like to do, I think. But knowingly or unknowingly, we have grabbed those wires. And so now the challenge really is, how do we let those wires go, before we get killed, before we get fried by that current. But more importantly, I think to make the analogy with climate change is how to convince people to let it go. How to convince people to let go, because after all, it's people that are doing this. And a number of academic disciplines are involved in this. This is a highly multidisciplinary problem. I know that Jim will be talking about this extensively. But I'm an environmental natural resource economist, and I think that economics has some role to play in this, probably a serious role. And two things come to mind. The first are in the area of instruments and incentives to convince people to act in the public interest. Economics has a lot to say about this. It's a social science. And especially where the private interest conflicts with the public interest. How to get people on board is one area I think that's very important. And some areas that you're probably familiar with are carbon taxes, cap and trade, community management, things like that. This is all in the instruments arena. Second area, which maybe at least is applicable in this case, is to not waste resources on ideas that turn out to be bad or a waste of money, and to promote good projects. Because sometimes heading off bad ideas is a very useful contribution. And so this brings us to the topic of cost-benefit analysis, which is a workhorse analytical tool of environmental natural resource economics and has been extensively applied in the realm of climate change. I teach this course here at Portland State, so I think this is a very useful one. But I think we have to raise questions. In this particular case, under what circumstances is this useful? I think this is a useful question to ask. Just to talk about some hypotheticals. What if, do the best analysis and we find that the so-called social cost of carbon, meaning the damages from a ton of carbon emitted, is $38 a ton. That happens to be the official U.S. government figure right now, $38 a ton. And suppose then that the analysis says to wait. Based on that number, even as we know here in Oregon, climate patterns are changing, weather patterns are changing, our winters are turning to spring, glaciers melt, sea levels rise, and so forth. What if it turns out that there's species that are affected? For example, as we all know, the carbon dioxide emissions get saturated in the ocean, decreases the pH, and affects mollusks. What if the cost-benefit analysis, hard-nosed analysis, says that it doesn't really pencil out? I think these are really relevant questions, and economists need to think very, very carefully about this. On the flip side of that, though, is what I started with. The value of cost-benefit analysis. What exactly is about the climate change problem that would make it somehow immune to cost-benefit analysis? What's different about this, if anything? And furthermore, where do we want to draw the line if we, in general, want to promote socially beneficial projects and activities and avoid crummy ones? So that is, that's something that's been on my mind recently in thinking about the climate change problem. And so now enter Jim Boyd. So no pressure, but to help us out, to help us think some of these through and maybe some other issues as well. And Jim is very well qualified to help guide us. This is a big question, and don't expect him or anyone else to have the answer, but to help move us in some direction. Jim's a senior fellow, and he's also the director of the Resources for the Future Center for the Management of Ecological Wealth. If you're not familiar, Resources for the Future is one of the preeminent environmental and natural resource economics research organizations in the world. His research lies really at the intersection of economics, ecology, and law, with a particular focus on the measurement and management of ecosystem goods and services. He co-directs a center which actually was created to work with practitioners, scholars, and policymakers to incorporate ecological science into public policies, including with regard to economics. Jim has a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, Penn, and a bachelor's in history from the University of Michigan. So well placed to deal with these issues. Jim. Just one last word, just a logistical issue. My colleague David Irvin will be coming around. We'll have plenty of time for questions, so please hold your questions for the microphone so that they can be captured properly. Thank you.
Hey everyone, it's great to be in Portland, and go Vikings. And well, Randy gave me really free rein, like, what do you want to talk about? And so I took the opportunity. Something I love to do is get a little bit of philosophical on these issues. So I want to engage you. It's too bad we can't have this be more of a back and forth dialogue. Hopefully we can get to that later. I'm not going to talk about cap and trade versus a carbon tax, things like that. What I want to engage you on is thinking about, we are thinking about nature in economic terms more and more. And how do you feel about that? And is that a good thing? And kind of tease this basic question out. So it really is this thing about how do we see nature and its importance to our lives and well-being? And does economics, is that a good way to do that or a bad way? You'll perhaps be annoyed at the end. It's, well, sometimes yes, sometimes not. And along the way, I'm going to expose some of our little dirty secrets in economics, like stuff we know that's wrong and can be misinterpreted, but that the general public, maybe we don't do as great a job explaining some of the limits of what we do. So with that, let me jump in. I've done some teaching recently, and I'm amazed at how young people are so different from when I was a young person. You know, some of them subscribe to the Wall Street Journal. You know, Freakonomics has been made into a movie. I find this all kind of bizarre, but I think we do live in kind of an economic age. We communicate as a society in, you know, terms of GDP and business economics, and so it's not really that surprising that you're seeing the way we talk about nature kind of take on some of this quality. And that's what I want to reflect on. Is thinking about nature in dollar terms, in money terms, is that a good thing? So with that, I need to start by, like, what do I mean by economics? And I got kind of three. Economics is a lot of things. Randy just gave you some examples. But the first thing, and maybe most intuitive, is this putting dollar values on nature. So I want to unpack that a little bit. Economics does do that. A second thing, though, and something that's maybe less obvious, is economists engage a lot with people who are managing nature, whether they're government agencies or businesses or NGOs, and helping identify trade-offs and target the way we spend our money and act so that we get the best outcomes. And then a third thing is, economists, a lot of times, we do think about the future, and here's where the climate change conversation is going to come into play. You know, what can we actually predict? And how should we be acting today, and what policies today to take account of the future are relevant? So that's kind of how I'm going to organize things. But let's get into this putting dollars on nature thing. These are just clips. I'm sorry for those of you in the back. I'll read out these headlines. The top one is probably the most famous article ever to put a dollar value, and the value of the world's ecosystem services and natural capital, and it's 33 trillion apparently. And then you get some other crazy examples. Bats are worth $3 billion a year. Wow. The oceans are worth 24 trillion. So you see these kind of headlines. What effect is that having on you? What kind of effect is that having on your neighbors? And is it good or bad? Final headline, we need to put a price tag on the Gulf of Mexico. Why? Why do we need to do that? So let me explore that. One reason is, you go into any grocery store, and we Americans have all kinds of crap we buy, and we're very accustomed to interacting with these market commodities, and we are aware they have a value, we pay money for them, and all that kind of thing. And part of the thing we do as economists, though, is we look at a landscape like this. This is like that grocery store. Nature is a place that you look at any landscape and there are valuable things there. Now, we're not accustomed to thinking about them in the same way as bars of soap and oatmeal and that kind of thing. But we all know that the water that's being stored and cleaned on this landscape is valuable to us. The food that's being produced there, the beauty, this is all valuable. And so part of what economics is doing is it's saying, hey, come on, you guys, remember that this stuff, even though we don't buy it and sell it, and we can't go to a grocery store and get it, this stuff is on a par, or even more important than all that crap in the grocery store. A second kind of very practical thing is we go to battle over this stuff. You go to court or should we build the Walmart? And Walmart's got their consulting studies. How many jobs is the Walmart going to bring? How much new tax revenue? And if you're worried about the wetlands or the open space that's going to be plowed under for that Walmart, maybe it would be good to be able to fight fire with fire, in effect, dollars to dollars, to wage war, in effect. And this happens. In government in Washington, where I waged a lot of my battles, this actually is very important to decision making at certain levels anyway. Again, apologies for this being hard to read. What it is it's an abstract for an analysis that went into a regulatory decision. This particular decision had to do with, should we impose tighter controls on trucks in terms of their particulate matter emissions. The thing I want to call out here is that question, should we impose this regulation, is answered by doing an incredibly sophisticated kind of epidemiological analysis that in the end allowed the EPA to say, yes, if we do this regulation, we're going to reduce deaths by 8,300 people. We're going to have 75 fewer hospital admissions for cardiovascular and respiratory incidents. And then the economists come in, and it's hard to maybe see at the bottom, and we say, yeah, like fewer deaths, fewer hospital visits, fewer asthma attacks, and that's worth $65 billion. Now, one thing I want you to ask yourselves is, did you need the $65 billion? I mean, what about that, isn't the deaths and the hospital admissions and the asthma attacks, isn't that enough for us to say this is a good idea? And that's going to be one of my themes. Do we really need that dollar value at the end? The sad truth is that a lot of people do need that. Congress needs that. They don't want to have to think about this. They just want to know, is $65 billion more than what it's going to cost? And so that's just the kind of truth of the matter. Another example of economics in nature, GDP. GDP captures this market economy, all that stuff on the shelves. And do I hate GDP? Yeah, I do, because it misses a lot of stuff. But would I actually want to get rid of GDP? Hell no, and here's why. GDP is a good, scientifically derived, it's not manipulated by politics. It's an objective measure of something that's happening in our country. Now, and so I love it as an accountability measure. The reason I don't like it is because of what it leaves out. And what it leaves out, of course, is all that stuff we don't buy and sell in stores. It's that beautiful landscape, it's the beauty, it's the species that don't have a price. And so you can ask yourselves, wouldn't it be great if we had a GDP for that natural economy? And if we did, that would be this incredible kind of accountability mechanism. We could hold our presidents to account, the EPA to account. And so I'd argue that could be a useful, if crude, use of economics as a way to hold our politicians to account. So just as a kind of a quick summary, the case for putting dollar values on things and explaining nature in these economic terms is these things are economically valuable. They matter to our well-being, and just because they don't have a price doesn't mean we shouldn't try to capture that value somehow. And that maybe will level the playing field. It's a communication strategy. It boils really complicated stuff down into a number, and sometimes that's good. People get something about 33 trillion. I don't actually understand how big that is, but it's this political strategy, how you fight these battles, and then it's a science. It's not just this kind of random thing we do, and so arguably it could guard against political distortion, arguably. So that's at least the beginning of my case for doing this. Now let's turn to the case for not doing it. And I'll start here. This is, again, apologies you can't read it, but Cecil Adams has this column in a lot of our urban newspapers. And this one is actually kind of amusing. It's like, Cecil, has anybody tried to assign a monetary value to the moon? If so, did they only take the mineral value into account, or did they include the other services the moon provides, such as the tides and enough light not to walk into signposts at night? And I read this as kind of an indictment of some of the things we do. It is ridiculous. Why is it so ridiculous? Well, one reason is we like to think about nature not in these kind of small v values, but in terms of our deep values, the capital V values. We're talking about beauty, wisdom, wonder, life itself. And so it can seem really bizarre, if not downright wrong, to be expressing it in this kind of fiscal manner. And of course, there are many, many things in life we don't put a price on, and they tend to be the most important things in life. Freedom, we don't put a price on freedom. We don't do cost-benefit analyses of going to war. I wish we did, actually. That would be good. So it seems weird that we should be doing this for our planet and nature. And as an economist, all I can say is I wear my economist hat. I can think that way, but believe me, I also think about this way, and I think most economists do, actually. Then this kind of pragmatic argument, like, is this actually helping with the politics? And, you know, politics and social change isn't usually about dollars and cents. It can be. But the climate change issue and many of our environmental issues, these are cultural conflicts we're having, value, capital V value conflicts. So if you're a tree hugger, do these dollar values matter to you? I mean, is that changing your mind? I would guess no. And then the other problem is that, like, if you're opposed to this tree hugger type stuff, you can always say, well, these dollar values are being generated by liberal elites and eggheads and people who are probably Democratic anyway or something. So I think it's important to question the political oomph that this stuff actually has, at least kind of in a broad way. And of course, our environmental values have a lot of political power without putting dollar values on things. The north slope of Alaska we protect, not because we know the dollar value of that, but just to protect it. So let me shift gears here a little bit. This is what I'll call the consumer's guide to environmental valuation. And so what I'm going to do here is, and apologies for those of you who've taken 101 and have been through some of this, but what I want to just quickly do is, how do we actually do this? And again, the problem we have as environmental economists is we want to value things that don't have a market price. And so we have to jump through all these hoops to try to solve that problem. But then what I'm really going to do here is explain, having done that, some things that are very obvious to us, but that we don't always communicate well. That when you see one of these valuations, it's almost always incomplete. It's just capturing a piece of what's going on in nature. You usually can't take a value that you've calculated for one thing in one place and time and just assume that applies to another community or another resource. And then I'm going to actually get at some of the junk science would be too strong a term, but some of the more bogus kind of economic valuations, at least in my opinion. And again, just to educate the consumer here a little bit. So let me dive in here. And again, this will go quickly. One thing we do is we look at how natural resources are bundled with things we do buy and sell. So houses is a classic thing. We look at house prices and we see how much more a house costs if you're near a forest. And we use statistics to do that. And if a similar house costs more when it's near a park or a forest or a wetland, we can attribute that difference to the environmental amenity. Again, is that getting at everything we care about? No, but we can do that. Another thing we can do is look at how, I drove out and had a wonderful hike in the gorge this morning. Well, I basically took a half day off work, and my time is worth something, and we spent some money on gas and a rental car, and you can look at how much people actually spend or the cost they bear to enjoy nature, and get some sense of value from that. Another thing we do, and if you've heard about green infrastructure, the substitution of natural landscapes for dams and levees, that kind of thing. You can actually look at, well, we don't have to pay for the dam and levee if we have this natural system that provides the same functions. So you can use the cost of the dam or the water treatment plant as a proxy for the value you're getting. If you're uncomfortable at all with, like, God, that's what you guys do, and that's fine, be uncomfortable with it. This is what we do. And then a fourth thing we do when we really run into trouble with the tough stuff, like how much does a species matter to you, just its existence. We do this thing called stated preference studies or contingent valuation, and you can think of this as a glorified opinion polling where we ask people to make a choice between, would you rather have your utility bill be higher and lower in exchange for something environmental? And it's just another way we're getting at this. So all of these methods have their warts and their difficulties. The main point I want to come to is that every time we do this, we're only capturing a sliver of what's going on. And that's because almost any natural resource is a bundle of things that are valuable. And when we're doing these studies, we're only capturing a piece of that bundle. So this, again, may be hard to see, but if I think about a particular landscape, it's providing these existence values that we care about the species. It's providing visual beauty. It's providing recreational opportunities. It's maybe helping avoid flood damage. It's contributing to the commercial harvest of fish. And the tools we use as an economists only tend to apply to one part of that at a time. And so it's very rare to see that kind of comprehensive thing going on. So again, we know this, but when we communicate with the broader public, sometimes this point gets lost. Another point that's important to understand is why it's very hard to take a value from one place and translate it to another. And the idea here is that an ecosystem service, it's like a house. The value is location, location, location. What is that natural resource near? If we're using it for recreation, are there recreators near there? If we're using it or thinking about it to support a commercial fishery, is there a commercial fishery there? Probably the easiest example of this is to think about Central Park in New York, the most valuable open space in the entire world. Valuable because of its recreational and visual amenities, not because of its ecological qualities. And the value here is derived from a very simple thing. Parks are scarce in New York, and a lot of people are really close to that park. And so we can't just take the value of Central Park and translate it to some other place. Now, I also want to turn to this thing about why valuations may be, why we should worry about why they're so difficult to come up with. And so 3 things I want to point out here. It's hard, we don't know our environmental values. We just don't. And that in part is because we're not used to thinking about choices about nature. Another point here is that I'll try to get to is how prices just don't actually measure importance. They measure something, but not the importance of nature. And then I want to get to how some of the most newsworthy valuations are actually pretty bogus. Okay. So this first thing, why are economists obsessed with prices? Well, several reasons. One is they're available, and we collect data on them all the time, and so we can play around with them very easily. But beyond that, and more deeply, if you pay a price for something, that means it's worth, if you're rational, that thing must be worth at least that much to you. So it tells us something about value. Relative prices can tell you about how people make trade-offs about things. Prices emerge from markets and competitive processes, and that's harnessing the wisdom of crowds. Adam Smith called it the invisible hand, but it's kind of the hive mind actually generates an incredible amount of information about values this way, assuming there's a functioning market. And then markets are actually training us about our values. So this is an example of what I'm talking about. Here's a thought experiment, like, okay, put a value on this car. I'd love to actually get someone to raise their hand, but I'm assuming you're all sort of thinking maybe 20K, something like that. You're generating a number fairly easily, I'm assuming. Of course, you don't know how many miles it has or anything. But then if I say, oh, what about this? Put a value on it. What I hope and expect you're experiencing is like, whoa, I don't know how to put a value on that. So what's the difference here? They're both valuable, but doesn't your kind of emotional and intellectual comfort with coming up with a guess on that? This one's a much harder thing. Assuming that's true and that's how you're feeling, the reason in part, at least, is that we're used to making choices about cars. We've bought and sold them ourselves. We've scrutinized the want ads. We're trained to think about the value of a car. We've paid our own money for a car. But with a wetland or a place like this, we really haven't. Now we have, to a certain extent, if we make recreational choices, we may choose to live near this wetland. That trains us in a certain way. But like, here's my personal example. I've spent a lot of time standing in front of beer displays. I know a lot about my value for different kinds of beer. And it's only because I've spent so much time going, is the Spaten worth an extra $1 or $2? I don't know. We know the value of gasoline, airline tickets, orange juice, again, things like that. But when it comes to nature, we're just untrained in this. We haven't learned about our own values because we're not engaged in that way. Wetlands aren't marketed to us. There's no ads for them. There's no standard definition even of what a wetland is. So point being, if you're asking me my valuation, I don't trust my own valuation. I sure as hell wouldn't trust yours. Second point, this is known to us as the diamonds in water paradox. The problem with prices is, the price of a diamond is very high and the price of water is very low. Now, that's simply sorry to be an economist, it's just a supply and demand thing. Diamonds are scarce, that's why the price is high. Water generally is not scarce, that's why its price is low. But which is more important? Clearly water is more important, you can't live without it. So that's an important point to keep in mind when prices aren't telling you anything about what's actually important in the world. All they're telling you about is something about supply and demand conditions in a particular context. Now, that still makes prices potentially useful. If we can put a price on nature, what you're really talking about is valuing, we use this term on the margin. It just means if I have one more little bit or one little bit less, how much is that worth? And that's what prices are helpful with. And that's actually very useful to a lot of decision making that goes on. Should I, as a state government, should I try to protect 100 more acres of wetland or clean the water just a little bit more? Those are marginal decisions and prices can be important guideposts there. But it's not telling us anything about the value of nature or how important nature is. It's more those small scale decisions that it's illuminating. So let's go back to these headlines. Again, this gets all the press. The kind of stuff Randy and I do, we don't make the headlines. This kind of stuff, it grabs the eye. Bats, $3 billion, okay. And I'm going to claim that these are bogus, and here's why. This paper, again, for those of you who know it, the lead author was Bob Costanza, who spent some time here at Portland State, and I have a love-hate relationship with this paper. The love is that I've seen its power over people, and in a way, it was good for us economists because it started to make it seem to the more ecological and environmental community like maybe economists aren't all bad and maybe they can help out here. So that was great. The hate part is that this really is a nonsensical result. And the reason is, one way of thinking about this is, I'm going to go back to the diamonds in the water. Which is more important, $33 trillion or the world's ecosystems? And so this generated a quip by one of my colleagues, which was 33 trillion is a vast underestimate of infinity. So if you're looking to that number for some sense of nature's importance, again, it's silly. It's too low a number. It's not too high a number. It's way too low a number. And then if you're looking at it as some sense a guide to decision making, it's basically equally useless because it's not pertinent to one of these decisions we're actually making. It's about something in total rather than about the real choices we make, which are these marginal choices. So anyway, I don't want to give this study too hard a time, except it's so damn famous and so exciting to so many people. I just wanted to explain why it kind of gives us heartburn. So now let me turn to the, how am I doing on time, by the way? I'm sorry to interrupt. My phone died. Okay. So why bother with economics? I've kind of ended on a low note here, but here I want to talk about this management perspective. And now I'm getting away from economics as putting dollar values on things, and I want to talk about economics as a learning process. This is where I get much more positive. So this is going to be maybe an upsetting metaphor for some of you, but I think of ecological systems as factories. They're factories because they produce all this valuable stuff. And we can manage them. We can protect factories. Which ones should we really keep open? Which ones maybe could we close? Which are the most productive ones? How can we tweak what's going into the factory so that it produces more? In that sense, I think it's a useful metaphor. And the key thing here is that another virtue of economics is it really explains why ecology is so important. So let me try to explain that a little bit. So this is an extremely crude, ridiculously crude example of a factory. So the inputs are on the left, like how many wetland acres do we have? That's something we can change with policy. How much nitrogen are we putting on farms? That's something we can change with behavior. How much forest are we protecting? So those are decisions that affect how this factory produces things, such as water quality. Now I'm an economist, and so I'm going to do something with figuring out the value of that water quality. But it's meaningless if I can't figure out those ecological processes and how the factory's actually working. So I love ecologists. I wish I were one. They're the most important people around right now. And the point is, economists love ecologists, and we need more and more of them and more from them. So what an economist would do is say, okay, those interventions, those real decisions we could make, they have costs. And then we work with our ecologists, and they tell us that water quality improves or it gets worse. And then we can, as economists, do something and try to put a value on that or talk about how that matters. Now, a slightly more realistic system would be to just add, nature's a weird factory, of course. It's very complicated. Everything's interconnected. The point I want to make here is that what we do a lot of the time is think about not only that water quality, but then how that water quality and then other ecological features create all this other beautiful stuff, fish abundance, for example. And that requires more ecology. Now, what economists are doing here is, if we can actually get some of this learning and knowledge and understanding, we can start relating those changes in what the factory's producing to people, to households, to farmers, to recreators, to just people who are stewards of nature and care about nature for that reason. And so that's kind of where we come in. And I do think that compared to 15, 20 years ago, this marriage of ecology and economics has helped connect nature to these kinds of social outcomes in a way that is illuminating. But it's illuminating as a process. Again, I don't necessarily care to put a dollar value to that farming community on this. What I care about is actually listening to the farming community, listening to the recreators, and having them be a part of this kind of process to learn about this ecological factory. And again, my problem with dollar valuation in a way is it dumbs us down. It stops us thinking about where nature really does matter to us and why it matters to us. And you can stop short of dollar values and still be learning a lot as a community and a society. So this is economics too, and something I'm much more positive about. Okay, climate change. This is like the factory on steroids. So, but first of all, let me make this point. So this early thing about putting dollar values on stuff versus our values. And climate can very legitimately be viewed, should we be doing cost-benefit analysis of climate change? I mean, again, that can seem insane. This is a question of right and wrong. It's a question of our deepest spiritual values and ethics. So please, why are we doing a cost-benefit analysis? And why are we engaging these economic arguments? Now, the truth is, too bad, it's already happening, and so let's talk about that. So again, more headlines. A lot of the climate debate already, it's being expressed as, well, what's going to happen to the economy? Or, again, putting one of these, $1 trillion in flood damage. And again, this is potentially a very powerful communication strategy, potentially. So this is already going on. When we open up discussion, I'd love to hear from you whether this is moving you one way or the other. Here's the factory again. This is the climate factory. And partly I'm putting this up to generate some sympathy for those of us who struggle with this. Again, a very simplified view of the factory. I've changed the things we act on, what kind of standards should we put on coal burning power plants? What kind of standards should we have for vehicle fuel standards, that kind of thing? How much investment in solar power should we be making? Those are things we can act on, change. That's where the real debate is. Now, those things have costs, and those are the easy things to measure, the costs. So then, those things affect our greenhouse gases, and those greenhouse gases then interact with the broader biological, biophysical system. The IPCC is engaged in these incredibly complicated and uncertain and difficult arguments and learning about how the factory is working, how do greenhouse gases affect precipitation, for example. And then those biophysical processes will change human health. They will change the abundance of our species and where they're located. They will potentially damage our property. And then the economists can come in and think about how the beneficiaries are losers and victims of that kind of thing, how much value is being gained or lost. So, have sympathy about this scientific challenge, both the biophysical challenge and then the economic challenge. But this is going on, these incredibly complex modeling efforts to try to get a hold of this. And again, we can debate whether that's valuable or not. Right now, the real front lines here are what's called the social cost of carbon. And it's coming from this kind of modeling effort, translating how climate's going to change all these outcomes that are important to our well-being, and then trying to translate that into a dollar value. And so you can think of the social cost of carbon as it's also the social benefit of reducing carbon, same thing. And I'm just going to quote from the EPA on what this is. It's meant to be a comprehensive estimate of climate damages, and it includes changes in agricultural productivity, human health, property damage, changes in energy system costs, reduced costs for heating, and et cetera, et cetera. So it's this attempt to kind of roll up that whole factory and boil it down to a number. So how are you feeling about that? So does this clear or cloud our vision of nature? Well, it's already affecting behavior. So this number, Randy alluded to it already, and I got it off by $1, maybe because of inflation, but it's already being used in the way our federal government is planning and regulating and the kind of rules, including the recent Clean Power Plan rule, the cost-benefit analysis that helped steer that through all of these political hurdles. They used this number to say, yes, we should do this regulation of power plant. This example from Minnesota, the state has actually adopted that number and is using it to basically set rates for solar energy generation that go back into the grid. And so it's actually generating this incentive to invest in solar, and it's changing behavior in Minnesota at least. So, okay, a positive dollar value is having this almost mechanistic effect on our government decisions and even on behavior. It's worth asking, though, is that number right? It's like, the number is $37, $38 per metric ton of carbon. Now, again, it's very hard for anyone. I don't have any intuition about whether that's, I don't even know what a metric ton of carbon looks like. Was that a lot? And so it's obviously very hard. We don't have any intuition about whether this number is right or not. And this is an ongoing scientific process. People are debating this number, and I think this is a good thing. There's a process in place to change the number as more facts are learned and as people debate this stuff. Just a couple of notes on the debate. One is there's this idea of discounting that is very important in economics, that the future is actually worth less than the present, and that becomes an ethical and, again, a philosophical issue. But changing that discount rate affects this number significantly. Another thing that affects the number is a lot of the existing models assume that climate's not actually going to affect economic growth, which can seem wrong and bizarre. And then there's a big question about how we as a society will adapt to climate change that also would change that number. This headline is just an example of how wide open the debate is. This came out earlier in the year. A group at Stanford said, no, it's not $37 per ton, it's 220, which is a pretty significant difference. And you have to be a real geek to get in and figure out why that it's all that different. But suffice it to say, this is an ongoing and extremely important debate. Another thing that's really important, if you go back to my factory diagram, what you want to do is capture all of the effects of carbon on our well-being. And that's not yet happening. So according to the IPCC, the social cost of carbon, it doesn't include all of the physical, ecological, and economic impacts. Why? Because the science isn't there yet. We don't actually measure this stuff well, and it's going to take time to generate this. One example that's really important and just a glaring gap that's not in that number is the effect of climate change and ocean acidification, for example, on marine species and the marine ecology. That's basically a zero number in that calculation. And so that's obviously a big problem. This is not the only example of that. So again, treat that number, it's good that it's a number higher than zero. The people who are calculating the number know it's wrong and that it's going to change. But I think it would be great for society more broadly, because this number matters a lot, to be more engaged in like what is missing and things like that. Okay, my final point here, the climate debate also features this thing about, there are some people who think that we shouldn't be doing too much today because we will adapt. And that, it's a cop-out, it doesn't feel right, it feels like we're delaying, it feels like we're imposing things on our children, not taking responsibility for the mess we've created. It's an annoying facet of the debate. Adaptation, particularly if you're not rich and Western, it'll be unfair, it's costly, it's going to affect a lot of people very deeply. The one point I'd make, though, is that there is something going on here, and it's coming mostly from economists, that is important to keep in mind. And that is that we do adapt, and we do innovate. And that makes that number and what we should do today a little bit more of a complicated problem. And so I'm going to throw up some, and again, I'm not giving the, oh, let's just adapt crowd an easy out here. But it's more so you, again, can be a sophisticated consumer and understand why any economist would even think that way. And it's that the Malthusians, the doom and gloom crowd, are often wrong, and historically have been wrong. Malthus was wrong. Paul Ehrlich, whose book I have up here, in the 70s, he's on the Tonight Show and got an amazing amount of press, and he was predicting that mass starvation and social upheaval due to lack of food, and he was wrong. And the reason the Malthusians are wrong is that we do innovate. And let me give you some current examples of that. And it's good news, bad news. Like, basically the way to read this diagram is that thing that is slowly going up, we are using more and more land to farm for our hamburgers and our other food. And so that stress continues to increase, but it levels off a little bit. But it's that yellow line, the declining line, that translates farmland area on a per capita basis. And that is going down significantly. And so when you combine that, and that's an innovation effect. We're just better at growing food than we were 40, 50 years ago, more efficient at it because we've innovated. Another example is global water consumption. Again, the columns are going up, 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 and that's not good. But the black line is that per capita number again, that per person we're actually using less water, and it's particularly true in the US. And that's because of innovation and adaptation. I've been, as many of you probably are, kind of amazed and impressed by what's happened in California recently. This incredible behavioral adaptation and the reduction in water use this year. And that's fascinating because it hasn't been law and regulation that's been doing that. It's actually been a change in just almost a cultural shift in, well, maybe I don't need a green lawn, and maybe I should do my bit for nature and all of that. So we do need to keep this stuff in mind. Again, it's not an excuse for doing nothing, but if you ever hear an economist saying, oh, well, we'll adapt our way out of it, this is partly where they're coming from. So to sum up, does economics clear or cloud our vision of nature? I've argued that, yeah, it can cloud. It's not a substitute for ethics and our capital V values. It's not telling you anything about the importance of nature. It is inherently difficult to put a price on nature, and that should give us all pause. The numbers we generate are probably wrong. The techniques can be abused. And when we focus on that number, again, it tends to shut us off from really learning and focus. I got a simple number. I don't have to think about this anymore. However, I am an economist, so I will end on a pro-economics note. Again, to me, economics actually really strengthens the need for greater ecological understanding. We are natural partners to the environmental community and the ecological teachers among us. I do believe that it helps tie nature, it helps us communicate about nature's role in our lives and think about the tough choices we have to face. I think it can help us predict the future to a limited extent. And believe me, it is actually changing behavior. These kinds of analyses, whether it's the social cost of carbon or whether it's these regulatory analyses, it does matter and it does change the way our governments and businesses and households behave, and often for the better in terms of the planet. So I'm going to end with a smiley face. And thank you very much, and I hope I've stirred you up a little bit.
Questions, and as I mentioned, my colleague Dave Irvin has kindly agreed to bring the mic to you. So just put up your hand and Dave will try to make his way over to you. We have about a half an hour for questions.
Dr. Boyd, thanks very much. That was very interesting. I want to push a little harder into one part of your presentation.
Good.
Both you and Randy referenced the social cost of carbon analysis, and in fact, the federal government comes up with 3 different social cost of carbon figures, not just the one that you described, and they're different depending on which discount rate you select. And I think you will agree that while it's important to be able to do comparative analyses using numbers to the extent possible, it's also really important that those numbers not distort reality any more than they have to. And if you selected, instead of the middle discount rate, which I think is a 3% discount rate, and ended up with a $38 cost of carbon, you selected a 2.5% discount rate. The cost of carbon is now, I forget what it is, something like $55.
Yeah, it's a lot higher.
A ton. It's a lot higher.
Yeah.
And the rationale for picking 3% or 2% is what I'd like you to maybe push a little harder into, particularly when you apply things like this to issues like intergenerational equity or species extinction. Lord Stern, I think, has made the argument that the discount rate for climate change impacts should be 0 or maybe even negative.
Great. First of all, a great clarification. The sensitivity, first of all, the government does, and I think it's good it does this, is it says, well, if you would prefer a different discount rate, which many of you do, here's the number. Now, they tend to use that, they call it the central value, this 30 $37 or $38. So that's why I focused on it. But just a brief tutorial. What is this discount rate thing? Well, current dollars in your pocket today are worth more than those same dollars in 10 years. And why do we say that? Well, because we know that people actually will pay to have dollars today rather than have to wait. It's literally our own behavior and our own choices that provide that evidence in a conventional market setting. So, businesses make money and governments set policy, and I don't really have a problem. If you didn't have a discount rate, that would be wrong in a conventional setup because of what's called the time value of money. So it's not this completely insane thing that we discount the future. However, we are talking about very long time periods. We are talking about things that are different than stocks and bonds and real estate in this context. And as you're absolutely correct, you get meetings of economists where economists coming to blows over this exact issue. It's fun to observe, actually, particularly if you don't like economists. And all I can say is there's very legitimate and unresolved debate, and going from should the interest rate be negative to something less than 10%. And given that debate, and what I'll argue is a complete still lack of clarity, there's so much disagreement that I can't claim that economics, we do not have the answer to that. So what we're left with then is this kind of sensitivity analysis where I do think it's important to give people that range of numbers, and again, to not just have the single $38 number. And again, in fairness to the EPA, they do actually communicate that range and sensitivity. But it's a very important issue because it affects the number in a huge way, as you know. So, do you have anything you want to add to that, Randy? Okay.
I'm interested in, you talk about valuations on, trying to put a dollar value on things that are kind of impossible to put a dollar value on. It seems that there are some inherent limitations on that sort of effort. Can you make the case that single bottom line capitalism is not inherently incongruous with effective efforts to combat climate change when you can't effectively put a dollar value on some of these things?
I'm sorry, I actually am having a hard time hearing you. Something, what kind of capitalism did you?
Yeah, just, can you make the case that given the limitations in putting a dollar value on some of these things, that single bottom line economics is not inherently incongruous with effective climate change combat efforts?
So if I understand the question, I may not. So if you're viewing capitalism as basically the market system, yeah, the market system, if left to its own, is incompatible, I would say, with the solution, and certainly incompatible with the optimal solution. Simply because, again, these are all externalities, and the market system is not actually capturing those, which is why we need cap and trade or carbon pricing is to solve those things. So, I may be misinterpreting your question, but capitalism, first of all, I'm an apologist for capitalism, but it needs to be policed. And again, to an environmental economist, policing it means, yeah, you gotta somehow have these incentives reflect the social costs and benefits of our behaviors. And if we can do that, capitalism is still okay with me. Again, I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but.
Yeah, pretty much. Just as a quick follow-up, do you have any suggestions or ideas for how maybe we could go about trying to measure externalities without a dollar value.
Oh. Yeah, well, actually, I try to do this a lot, and again, it depends on how you're applying it, but I'm a big believer in, so one of the things that I think is hard in terms of our broader society understanding what's going on in nature is that the people who study natural systems are often academic scientists, and they don't always communicate that clearly or in terms that resonate with us. Let me give you an example. And I love these people, but they'll tell you something about how the index of biotic integrity has improved by 10%, and you go to your next door neighbor and they don't have any idea what the hell that means or why it matters. It does, but so I think getting the ecological science to actually express outcomes that your next door neighbor would understand, that you would understand, that biotic integrity index is telling us something about water quality and the species in that water. And getting the ecological science, the science of that factory, to do a better job of communicating outcomes that we can just understand. If we can do that, we don't need to put a dollar value on things. That's why I put up that example at the beginning about the asthma attacks and the hospital visits and the deaths. I think if we can get our ecology to a point where we can be delivering outcome measures like that, communities and individuals can make their own value judgments about how important that is. Now, having said that, we still need prices if we want to change market behavior. And that's just how we do it. And so I think we can't back away from prices, not as measures of value, but as incentive generators. So the social cost of carbon, I mean, again, I'm sure it's wrong, I'm sure it's too low, and yet I love that it exists already because it's creating these incentives to install more solar power in Minnesota, for example.
So if you have a question, raise your hand. I've got one more back here.
I was just wondering, does the social cost of carbon include the benefits of carbon to our society in terms of how fossil fuels generally have a much higher power ratio than almost every other alternative we have right now?
I don't believe so. I mean, I think that value is captured in other ways. So in principle, that's being captured by vehicle prices, and the market economy is probably picking up that kind of benefit. This is really geared toward picking up benefits that would be more public benefits, and therefore you don't see anywhere in any kind of economic activity. So, but economists are aware that carbon is not all bad, and not everyone's going to lose. There are going to be some winners, and anyway.
Okay, next question.
When you are trying to evaluate the value of a small ecosystem in monetary values, do you ever try and factor in the replaceability of something versus a factory-made commodity? I mean, you have a car that comes off of a factory line, that's pretty easy to calculate. You have a wetland that would take a lot of effort
Yeah.
to replace.
Yeah.
Is that ever factored in?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, we do as a profession think about this. We call it, it's related to what we would refer to as the option value, which is when it's difficult to reverse a decision, such as, that's basically the story you're telling, like, okay, we can get rid of the wetland, but then if we want it back, we're kind of stuck. We do, it's related to the value of information and your ability to reverse a decision, and that's what generates something called option value. And so there is a value independent of the wetlands value for its beauty and all that, in certain cases like that, to protecting it and waiting for further information to decide whether you should get rid of it or not because of that irreversibility problem. Then, so we do have, that's part of our canon, if you will, and yeah, it is something we don't always, we probably don't do it in that many examples actually, but we teach it and some of us actually do it, so. Yeah, good question.
I think I'm a little older, but not than most people in the crowd, but not everybody. And I'm a little skeptical. I watch a lot of, these documentaries and stuff.
Yeah.
And they're pretty depressing. Makes me glad I'm as old as I am. I don't have to face the same stuff that you guys are about to.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering. For example, I took economics 30-something years ago as a engineering student at NC State when we won the championship. But anyway, that was a long time ago. And the economics class, the micro, the macro, and then another time value of money type class that we took. We didn't, there wasn't anything environmental about it. And I'm noticing that, you're speaking a lot about environmental, and you're speaking about, when you talk about environmental economics, you're going beyond dollars to, what you call real value, which is very important. I'm just wondering, in general, environmental economics, how, and this is just a concern for the future here, how much is environmental economics being incorporated into economics curriculums across the country and across the world?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, you'll be pleased to know that there are a lot of us. You're absolutely right. 30 years ago, so this organization I work for has been around for 63 years, and it used to be the only place that was a kind of safe haven for economists. They didn't call themselves environmental economists, they were just economists who were starting to think about nature more. And so if you go back 50 years, it was the only place. But places like Portland State, Oregon State, over the years, this is now a core. First of all, they're producing a lot more students, a lot more faculty. It's not just here in the U.S., it's all around the world. What was a really small community even 30 years ago, there are thousands of us now. Be afraid. And there's a lot of demand for it in business schools, not just in economics departments, in a lot of interdisciplinary environmental management programs. So it's wonderful actually. It's working, and we are spreading and growing like an amoeba. I hope that is good news. But
First, thanks for the great talk. Very
Sure.
interesting. So a question, you presented a thought experiment that was very intriguing. The car versus the wetland. And I looked at the car and I said, oh yeah, I could put a value on that. And you do that with the wetland, and yeah, it was a lot harder. But you're suggesting that there is a price with that wetland that we can put on it, which is almost to say that that price is somewhat manipulative. You can manipulate it, you can change it, which I would think makes a lot of people very uncomfortable. I mean, a price of a car has a very matter-of-factness to it. So you present a price with carbon, and I guess maybe I'm a little bit more trained to not be surprised by seeing a cost associated with that. But it is surprising with the wetland because, yeah, what is it? And if you were to put one on it, it would seem arbitrary. And then you would say, well, it's just to incentivize us, it's to change our behaviors. And I would be like, well, who are you to do that? So could you respond to that?
I'll try. So I don't know. first of all, I think we're in a way agreeing, well, so my point is the wetland, it does have a value. It's not zero, it's not negative. It does have some positive value, right? Right? Okay, so we agree on that. And then I was making the point though that, and again, I hope I made this clear, that this is one of the reasons I think it's healthy for people to have some skepticism about the values. If someone's generating a value, this is why you should be skeptical of it. I'll give you another reason too. Okay, let me do that. So one of the things about that wetland is you can put a value on it as, imagine you're standing there, or you live near there, or you want to hike around there. That's part of the value of the wetland. But then the wetland also has this, it's part of the factory, it's an input to this whole other set of processes. It's changing the quality of the water 20, 30, 100 miles away. It's recharging aquifers. And that stuff we don't even see, but that's part of the value too. So I'm really freaking you out. But anyway, the point being, that stuff is valuable. I know it's valuable. I can do my best to put a value on it in a variety of ways. But none of us in the profession, I really think, none of us think that is the value. So it's kind of more of a mea culpa. This is what's going on. We want to do our best. We know it has a value. Let's take our best shot at it. But it's absolutely legitimate to be skeptical about that. And I think the word manipulation is pushing it too far. Anyway, I don't know if I answered your question, but okay. All right.
How do you think that this discussion of putting a monetary value on environmental areas may hurt or help or shape the jobs versus environment debate that happens in politics?
Oh, yeah. Good question. Well, one way of thinking about that, so a lot of times, many economists actually are uncomfortable talking about the jobs arguments. It's kind of a funny thing amongst us. Sometimes we try to abstract from jobs, like just because you're creating the Soviet Union created a ton of jobs, right? So that maybe shouldn't be the goal. So that's part of our reflexive discomfort with it. I think you have to, this becomes literally a case of argument. And again, where if I were going to lose my job and some study said, well, it's okay you're losing your job because some economist came up with some number, that would not work for me. So this is another reason why, but if the story can be told about where that value is coming from and that maybe it's producing other kinds of job opportunities or health benefits, and we're learning about that, then that becomes that's a fairer fight, I would say. And of course, the jobs thing, it's unclear. I think if we move, obviously, to a lower carbon economy, there are going to be winners and there are going to be losers. The Clean Power Rule, this was a huge thing. It's not good for the state of West Virginia and coal-based industries there. And, but and I have sympathy, but on the other hand, I think we have to make those kind of transitions and help the people who are disadvantaged by that in other ways than just continuing to burn coal. So, yeah.
I have a question. With you said that you can put a value kind of on a wetland. Is there a different value on like different types of ecosystems? Like a wetland might be more difficult to restore. Let's say you want to build a Walmart and then you're like, oh, never mind. So then you want it back. But let's say maybe like a small forest would be easier to restore. Is there a different economic value for different ecosystems?
Oh, hell yeah. I mean, that's part of the problem. They're all different. So they're different on this dimension. There's this kind of, the point that was brought up earlier about reversibility. Yeah, it is actually, in some ways, easier to replant and regrow forest than to alter the hydrology of a wetland system. But again, yeah, each forest, that depends on the kind of trees and what kind of species in that landscape can migrate through that forest. This is part of the problem, that the value, in a way, it almost depends too much on the specifics, and so it's easy to get lost in that specificity, and it keeps me up at night, actually.
Other questions? That haven't asked a question already? Okay.
So something else I was wondering is, so our modern standards of living are entirely based on cheap energy. And as you said, the Malthusians like Ehrlich have been proven wrong consistently. These doom and gloom models never pan out. So at what point do we decide to trade off between quality of life, easy access to cheap energy, and preserving the environment? Because at some point it is going to have serious impacts on the quality of life. And just as we've seen with the regulation against coal, energy prices have gone up. And that's affected poor people disproportionately in this country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I'm not going to stand here and give you the answer to that question. I mean, this is the debate we need to have in our society. It's complicated. I will say that part of what's going on with this kind of analysis is there is this sense I hold, and I think I would defend, that the deck is a little bit stacked. The deck is stacked toward the here and now versus the future. It is going to cost us money to act now to improve our future. That's something that humanity has a hard time with. The deck is stacked to emphasize, and we see these market goods. We have a much harder time seeing the non-market wealth around us. And so really what this is doing is it's not denying, those immediate costs would be absolutely real, and some people would lose. I don't think any economist would deny that. I do think, though, what's going on, as we're saying, even so, we already feel like we've got a pretty good handle, and that's going to emerge in the political process. It's going to clearly emerge and easily emerge in analysis. What is less clearly going to emerge and matter to the politics is thinking about the other side, thinking about the future, thinking about what it's harder for us to see and value. And that's all that's going on. It's not to deny that climate action is going to cost money or anything like that. So, yeah.
Can I ask a quick follow-up question? So, if we're talking about the future in terms of environmental degradation, is there not also the future of lost economic growth by making plans for the future to preserve the environment, especially when all these models have been wrong by and large?
Yeah, well, again, I'm not, future environmental growth, economic growth is absolutely important. Again, I'm not denying the importance of those things in any way. All I'm trying to do is advance the notion that we should be measuring, just trying to paint the most complete picture we can, that's all. Yeah.
I just wanted to follow up a little bit about the why coal is cheap, because we are not including the negative externalities of damage to water supply. These are political choices, and so trying to capture the social cost of coal, for the future is one thing to deal with climate change, but if we made the political choices to include the actual costs of coal mining and mountaintop mining in the price of coal currently, the price would be a lot higher.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah. Environmental economics 101. Exactly. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
It's not just about the future.
Yeah. Thank you.
So with all the various environmental issues, mercury in the oceans, global warming, all of that stuff, is there any particular externality, if you were going to pick one to address that you would think would be especially beneficial?
My favorite externality. No, I honestly, that's a fact. No one's ever asked me that question before. Do you have a pet externality, Randy? I do think the problems, one thing I will say is the mismatch and the market failure, if you will. One crude metric is the market failure tends to grow with literally the geographic scale of the externality. And that's because our institutions don't do a particularly good job. Like if you live in a community, you live in a particular city, the tighter the community, we have non-governmental ways to sort out our externalities. Primitive society had ways of punishing the creator of the externality. But when you get to the level of a global commons problem like the climate issue, that's where our the difficulties of actually coming together and self-policing become extremely difficult. An intermediate example would be the difficulty of getting all of the states in the Mississippi Delta, some of the pollution that comes down through the Delta affects the Gulf of Mexico. You're talking about dozens of states. And the idea of organizing all of them to somehow collaborate around internalizing this problem is just a more practical institutional problem. And so that's a crude answer that the scale, literally the geographic and therefore jurisdictional institutional scale of the problem is a crude proxy for how big the inefficiency would be. I don't know.
Other questions?
Well, maybe if there's, if Jim's exhausted you here, draw the session to the close. I'd like to just thank you all for coming today and invite you back again, and also ask you to join me in thanking Jim for the presentation.